that they have in the 70s at sort of a Black Power moment in New York when they're both squatting in this house together. And in the book, in Malamud's view, I think it becomes very clear that everybody's authenticity is predicated on everybody else's. Or if, you know, everybody's authenticity is predicated on everybody else's existence and subjectivity. And I think that, you know, I don't really, you know, I mean, all I know of Shapiro is the sentences you're reading me, but I really wonder about his investigations into this whole notion of blackness and authenticity, because I think that there's an extremely fraught and complex and ongoing history and discussion of what that means, what authenticity means, in the context of blackness. So it doesn't strike me. It strikes me as a little bit glib, I guess.
Do you think there's something to? I'm struggling how to phrase this. There seems to be like a much more eager need among certain Jews to be embraced by blacks than by blacks to be embraced by Jews. Do you sense that? See that?
Not necessarily. I mean, on one hand, yes, and I think that that the story there has to do with an awareness on the part of Jews. You know, first of all, Jews as a subset of white people, people who are seen in the world predominantly as white and have the privileges endemic to that, right? I think what that has to do with is validation, which semantically divorces you from privilege and makes you not have to feel guilty. In other words, if black people accept you, then you don't have to really grapple with what it means to have all of these unearned, inherited, you know, sort of privileges granted to you by society. I think that's been the dynamic, particularly of my generation, of the hip-hop generation, is this notion that if you, this is what my book, Angry Black White Boy, is largely dealing with, is the notion that constant affirmation from black people is the best way to, and you know, that extends to living in sort of a hip multicultural community, and all kinds of other things, is a way to divorce yourself from privilege rather than sort of confronting it and figuring out how it might be dismantled. So I think that need for affirmation is a subconscious or sometimes conscious awareness of privilege, which makes people feel uncomfortable, makes them feel like, you know, if they were to really look at it, it would force them to deal with things that are too complicated and too painful for them to really think about. The flip side of that is that, you know, I know, you know, sort of being the guy that I am and moving in the communities I move in, I can't even tell you how many sort of like black Jewophiles I know. You know, how many black friends I have who say, man, you know, I wanted to be Jewish when I grew up, or you know, my community was black and Jewish. And I was so comfortable with these Jewish folks. I wanted to be around them. You know, I mean, my friend Scott Polson Bryant, who's a writer, an essayist and a novelist who teaches at Brown right now, is one of these folks. Angela Woodson, who is somebody I do a lot of talks with, who works at the Ohio governor's office, is constantly talking about sort of her fond memories of Jews growing up. And you know, I know plenty of black people who speak more Yiddish than I do. You know, I think that there's it's not something that gets a whole lot of attention or is talked about publicly very often. But I think, you know, my experience has certainly been that there is a real reciprocal interest. You know, it's totally anecdotal, of course, but that's what I've seen.
Okay, awesome. Anything that I should have asked you about your new book that I have not asked you?
Is there anything? Is that what you said?
Yeah. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that I should ask you?
I mean, I don't know. Probably. You know, it's always interesting to me because any time that I get talking to somebody ostensibly like about my book, particularly somebody smart and interesting like yourself, we always end up totally far afield, and it never ends up being like, so tell me about chapter 3, or, you know, why do you use semicolons the way you do? It always becomes like a much broader sort of socio-cultural discussion, which I think is great. And in some ways, it's like, that's hopefully, you know, it's like the work of the book is to get some of those conversations going. But, you know, at times it can be, you know, it can be, sometimes, you know, sometimes I sort of yearn to actually talk about craft, or talk about, you know, sentence structure, or talk about, you know, the book itself in some kind of sustained way that doesn't sort of use it as a point of departure for a whole different conversation, as interesting as that conversation might be. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I hear you. And that the first 3 chapters seemed quite different than the rest of the book. I'm wondering if I'm just totally out to lunch. But the first 3 chapters seem like very traditional commercial storytelling. I mean that in a positive sense. And then the rest of the book is much more complicated. Is there anything to that?
Complicated in what sense?
Well, the first introducing each protagonist, it seems linear. Like the story's going somewhere, and I'm forming expectations for how this story will go, and then the rest of the book explodes my expectations.
That's interesting. What expectations?
Well, the first, I mean, Tristan. I thought, oh, this is going to be the story of the rise of a great Jewish novelist who came out of this background that was not really friendly to writing novels, and this was going to be about the rise of this novelist. Instead, the rest of the book is about his fall and somewhat climb back up, but I expected it to be about his rise, and then I expected Nina, this would be about her rise as a great photographer, but really it's about her struggles. And then the same with Tris. So, you know how traditional, like Harold Robbins. Ever read any Harold Robbins?
No, actually.
Oh, okay. Well, he's like the quintessential commercial novelist. I mean, his story is all about someone who's poor, who works hard, gets a lot of sex and success, and then fails, and then gets more sex and success.
Yeah.
You know, and so I start the book and okay, this guy's poor and he's in a Jewish ghetto, and he's just starting to explore the outside world and starting to find his range as his meter as a novelist. And then boom, when I encounter him again, it's not about his rise, it's about his struggle.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I certainly didn't set out to build up, you know, in those first 2 chapters. I definitely didn't set out to create a set of expectations that I was then going to foil. You know, I didn't intend any sort of misdirection. I guess I don't know. To me, I mean, you know, those first 3 chapters are sort of the start points for each of these characters in some way. Moments that set them on a certain path. But you know, I certainly tried to, you know, sort of anticipate in terms of character, in terms of gesture, that none of these folks was going to have an easy time of it. You know, in a lot of ways, there's this in all 3 of those chapters. There's sort of this relationship between the artist and some kind of outside cultural force, and in all 3 cases, it's some element of black culture that sort of provides a spark, but also, I think, points toward a relationship that's going to be difficult. You know, the primary relationships set up in all those chapters, I hope anyway, are tense even from the beginning. Tristan and Pendergast, Tris and his grandfather,